Hi, it's Courtney and welcome. Today I'm using a stamp set by Winnie and Walter called Purrfect. This is a larger stamp set and the images on it are pretty large, and I wanted to make sure that I could fit a lot of the images on one card, so I'm actually making a 5x7 card today. I started off by using my T-squared ruler and just draw a line down the center of the card. This will be where my floor separates from the wall. I laid out my mask just to kind of get an idea of where I was going to stamp my images, and then began stamping my images using Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, and I'm stamping on Neenah 80-pound solar white cardstock. Once all of those images were stamped and masked, I took this image in the top right corner and just used a T-square ruler and a pencil to go ahead and draw lines around that. My plan was to make this look like a picture hanging on the wall. So once I was happy with the placement of those pencil lines, I went over those lines with a Copic Safe pen, in this case a Cricut pen, and added those lines. Once those were down, I added additional lines on the outside of those, about 1/8 of an inch out. I just did this freehand, I didn't measure, and then connected those corners to finish off that frame. Next, I took Post-it note tape and masked off the top of the card. I'm going to go ahead and do some ink blending with pumice stone distress ink, and this will be for my floor. I concentrated towards the masking itself because the back would be a little bit darker than the front, and I just used one color here. Once that was done, I removed my Post-it note tape and I needed to mask off that picture frame. And being I freehanded that and there's nothing to cut out, I'm using my liquid Frisket and just covering that up. You'll also notice that a piece of that tower toy that the cats have, that came up with my Post-it note tape, so I'll be just filling in those areas as well. Once that was dry, I went ahead and masked off the bottom with that same Post-it note tape, and I'll also be doing distress inking for this as well. I'm using crushed olive, and I'm just putting on a very, very light layer to begin with, and I'll be adding a little bit of dimension to this with just strips that I cut out from that Simon Says stamp masking paper. And I use the grid lines on my mat here to space them out evenly. Once those were down, I went ahead and added another layer, being a little bit more heavy-handed with that same distress ink and crushed olive. I went ahead and removed all my masks and then on with the Copic coloring. Before I started my coloring, I went ahead and went over that line that separates the floor and the wall with my Copic Safe pen. Now for the cats, I colored them all a little bit different, even though I did repeat some of the colors. For this first one, I'm using my warm grays. I wanted to keep her pretty white, so I'm only using the darkest color, which is a W5, pretty sparingly, and adding in my shadows. Then I went on with my W3 and my W1. When I use my lightest color, I use a flicking motion just to make sure I do leave some white areas. And because I wanted to make her look furry and fluffy, I went ahead and went over the entire thing with the 0 marker. Just keep in mind that when you do use your colorless blender, it will look a little bit different once it dries. So give it a minute or two before you decide whether you need a second layer. For this little tabby cat, I'm going on with my C markers. And for a majority of his body, we're going to use the lighter color. So I'm starting with my lightest color, which is the C1, then going on to with my medium color and just adding in where those shadows will be. And then I'll add my darkest, which is the C5, then back to my C3 and back to my C1 to fill in the rest of his body. For his little stripes, I used the C7 marker. I didn't do any shading on these. These are pretty small areas, so I just used that one color, and I added some additional stripes on his little face. And that's my cat in the background. For on to the next cat, there's some lines already drawn on this stamp to make it look like he is spotted. So I decided to make him a black and white cat using, again, my warm grays. For the black spots, I used the W7, W5, and W3 for the highlight. And for the white areas, I used the W3 and W1, making sure that, again, I'm leaving those white areas. My W1 seemed to be a little dry, so I was having a hard time blending that out. So again, in those whiter areas, I did go ahead and go over that with my 0 marker. For this next cat, I used a combination that I wouldn't normally use. This is the first time I've used this combination, but I wanted to give him a kind of a yellowish golden look. So I knew I needed to have a darker color, so I did use a brown for just my shadows. I knew I would have maybe a little bit of a harder time blending these, so I did start with my lightest, go to my medium, go to my dark, back to my medium, and back to my light again. I'm going right over those strings. My plan at the end was to go over those with a gel pen, so I wasn't worried about covering those up. I did have to go over certain areas a few times just to make sure that the colors did blend. If you're having a hard time blending, just keep going over it or adding the mid-tone to flick that out a little bit more so that you get that blend that you're looking for. For this little tower, I'm using my E31, E33, and E37. I'm going in with my lightest color just to add my shadows, map out where my shadows will be. They'll be over underneath those little stands that the cats are sitting on, and this little bed that they have built in. This would be round, so I'm doing my shading on either side just to give it that round look. For this next cat, I wanted to make her a little calico cat. So I'm using browns, grays, and for the white areas, I'm also using grays. And this is where I made my first mistake. I started coloring that tail that's kind of sticking in the air. And once I got about halfway through, I realized that that is not her tail, that's the other cat's tail. So instead of making that one a tabby cat that I was originally planning to do, I had to make him a little bit darker of a brown color in order to cover up what I had done to his tail. There weren't a whole lot of spots drawn in on this stamp, so I just created my own. The only spot that's actually drawn in there is the one right on the face. So I just added different spots and left her primarily white, but added those little brown and gray areas. For this next cat, this will be my second mistake. I started with my lightest color and my marker blobbed. So what I did is I just added a paper towel underneath my cardstock because it will bleed through, and take my colorless blender and just hold it over the area where I needed to pick up that color. Let it dry for a couple of seconds, and you may need to do this a few times. Just don't move around that marker because it will just smear it off to the sides. You just want to hold it right over it. In order to prevent this from happening again, I went ahead and removed both ends, and I was fine to finish the cat. Now for the box that this little chubby cat is sitting in, I started by mapping out my shadows with my lightest color, then came in with my darkest color. On the bottom of the box, there's little lines drawn in that make it look like the box is squished. So I went ahead and extended those a little bit further than I normally would have to make it look like the box was kind of squished because of the chubby cat sitting in it. If you happen to go out of the lines a bit with your Copics on top of Distress ink, you can use your colorless blender to kind of fix that up. It won't be noticeable, it won't smudge the ink, and it will not smear. For the little picture frame, I drew my shadows just in the corners to kind of make it look a little bit shiny, and I used the same colors as I did for the box. For the picture itself, I decided to keep it simple and just make it kind of like a silhouette. So I'm using my warm grays and just adding in my shadows with my lightest color, then moving on to my darkest, then my medium, and then back to my light. For the little ball of yarn, I did color this with reds. For the ball itself, I used my Copics, but then I'll go ahead and add my gel pen for those little areas. I was just too nervous to use the marker these are really, really fine areas. Next, I took a W marker and just fixed up those areas where my masks may have been covering too much of where I did the ink blending. And then I was ready to add my sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black Pigment ink. And we are all set. Thanks so much and have a great day.